Hello everybody and welcome to another verdict video. Today I want to talk a little bit about the final season of The Walking Dead and maybe a little bit about the whole series in general now that we are done with it. And I think I would like to structure my discussion in a similar way that I did my verdict video of the previous season. And as you may remember, I picked basically 3 issues that kept occurring during the franchise, and I would like to see how this season held up in regards to these issues. And these issues were basically 1, repetitiveness, 2, let's call it misery fatigue, when so much bad stuff is happening that it overwhelms you and you kind of stop caring about what's going on because it's going to end bad one way or the other. And 3, the occasional bit of contrived writing, which usually manifests itself in characters in the game making the worst decisions ever to increase the drama of any given situation. Now, not every season had these issues, or not in the same degree. Some were better in some regards and other seasons were better in other regards. But they were certainly 3 points of criticism that kept occurring during the whole franchise. And without going too far ahead in my discussion, let's just say that I thought that this final season actually performed pretty well in regards to all of these issues. So I have a lot of good things to say about this last season. And after I have talked about that, I may talk a little bit about a few other random aspects, basically a few things that occur to me while playing the game. But while playing the game, there's usually not a lot of time to actually discuss some of these issues. So I will maybe talk about them later, depending on how long the actual review part takes. I don't want to make this video too long, so this may or may not happen at the end of this video. But yeah, let's start with the actual review part. And this time I actually want to say a few words on the gameplay. I more or less skipped this in the previous review because the gameplay didn't really change at all. Now for this season, they did change the gameplay, at least more significantly than they ever did before, because they committed to a sort of third-person view, so you could walk around and turn around and look around everywhere. And I have mixed feelings about this change. On the one hand, I thought it was great for just exploration and walking around because you could get a better feel of a place, you could better explore what was going on, and it felt more immersive because it felt more like you're actually there and you can look at everything. So that was actually pretty neat. But as you may have seen throughout this playthrough, I didn't really get along with the new, quote-unquote, new combat system. I died a lot more in this game than I did before. I mean, it's still just like quick-time events, but they seemed a little bit more random in this game because I was never really quite sure why sometimes, when I try to attack a zombie by stun or kill, sometimes it would work and then the next one would just bite you. It felt very arbitrary, this combat system. It didn't really feel responsive. And in the previous games, well, you had your QuickTime event, which was scripted to happen at a very specific moment, and then you just had to go through with it. So it seems that they kind of wanted to make it a little bit more, fluid and a little bit more adaptive to the situation, but it just felt clunky and I didn't like it. I mean, it wasn't terrible, but I was not a fan of this new kind of, fighting zombies by choosing how to stun them or kill them, because it didn't really feel very intuitive. But I did like walking around just for the sake of exploration, so that is fine with me. And since we're talking about gameplay and game design, there's one thing that I would like to highlight as well. It is something that I have mentioned in previous discussions before, and that is the fact that they do pretty good facial animations for, characters that are not really supposed to be like super realistic. But I feel that in this game, it was particularly well done, especially AJ. When AJ was sad, he really looked damn sad. I mean, that one scene with young AJ at the end of the game when Clementine rescued him from that wrench, he looked just heart-wrenchingly sad, and that was really well done in terms of facial animation. So this is just something that I wanted to highlight. It was very well done in previous seasons too, but for some reason it really struck me as particularly well done in this one. But yeah, everything else in regards to gameplay and game design is more or less as it was before, and it's fine the way it is, so I'm not going to talk about that. Instead, now let's talk about the 3 issues that I mentioned, and let's see if they were a problem in this season or not. Now, the first one that I mentioned is repetitiveness. Now, I would say that this season was doing okay in that regard. Certainly, there was some amount of repetitiveness, but it didn't really feel so bad. I actually thought that the second season was the one that felt most repetitive to me, interestingly enough. The third season was okay in that regard because we had new characters and the world had changed a little bit with people settling down a little bit more. So again, that didn't really feel like it was just a repeat of a previous season. And again, in this game, it was a bit different because it was a lot more stationary. It was basically all in one place, Erickson and the immediate surroundings. You didn't get to meet a whole lot of new characters once you got introduced to the main characters, which were the people in Erickson, and then Lily and her group, and, well, James, but that was pretty much it. Whereas in previous seasons, you were usually on the road and would travel from one spot to another and meet new people all the time. This wasn't really the case in this season, and it gave us a bit more time to develop characters, and I thought this was a nice change compared to previous seasons. Now, the third season was going in that direction already. Compared to season 1 and 2, the people in the third season didn't really travel that much, but it's in this season where they finally decided, okay, we're going to let the entire game take place in basically one place. So the place actually started to feel a little bit like home. I mean, you had your room, you could decorate it, so that was certainly interesting. Nevertheless, there obviously still was some amount of, repetition, certain situations that were similar to something that we have seen before, like the inevitable, you have to make a choice between 2 people and you can only save one of them, and whatever you do, it's never going to be the right decision. Or you have like a bad person who's like that cruel tyrant type of person, and then suddenly the tables change and you have to decide what to do with that person. In this case, it's Lily, and we had Carver before, and I thought that was kind of similar in some regards. So yeah, there were some repetitions, but it didn't really feel that similar because the whole, context was still different enough. So I would say overall the amount of repetitiveness in the season was, low to medium maybe. So certainly not a big problem. So let's move on to the second issue, which would be the, misery fatigue, where, you just get overwhelmed by all the pain and death and misery that's happening to your characters in this game. That at some point you kind of expect it to happen and you kind of expect everyone to die. And I gotta say, in this regard, this season was a huge improvement. I mean, when I came to Erickson, I almost expected that by the end of the game, most of the people in that place are going to be dead by the end of a game, because that's usually how it works. I actually went to the Walking Dead Wikia to look up like the characters from specifically season 1 and 2, and this really opened my eyes. How many of them died by the end? Basically, almost every one of the people that you traveled with in season 1 and 2 were dead in the end of the game. In the first season, you basically only had Clementine who survived, and technically Kenny and Lily. I say technically because, Lily was abandoned on a road, and it seems like she had little chance of survival. As it turns out, apparently she did survive. And Kenny, well, he was certainly presumed dead. I mean, his final scene in season 1 certainly looked like he was dead. I actually believe that his reappearance later may have been a bit of a retcon, because I'm not sure if they really planned for him to survive that. So, for all intents and purposes, by the end of season 1, Kenny was technically dead, because everyone believed he was dead. And only Lily, okay, she probably had at least some chance of survival, even though we abandoned her on a road full of zombies. So I guess she would have been missing in action. But basically everyone else of your initial group was dead by the end of season 1. And it was essentially the same in season 2. So you had like Luke and Nick and, well, Alvin's parents, and they all died. And in the end, you had Clementine and AJ Jr., and in my case, Kenny. And I think it could have been Jane instead. But again, everyone else dies. So if we look at the current season in comparison to that, of the kids of Erickson, we had basically 4 people dying, of the kids that were in Erickson when Clementine arrived. Marlon, Brody, Mitch, and 10. And 10 could have been Lewis or Violet. But compared to the people that did survive, that is actually a surprisingly small amount of people. In season 1 or 2, by the end of this game, everyone in that school would have been dead. That is basically how you would expect a Walking Dead game to end. And it didn't. And that was actually a very nice surprise. Because they paid more attention to, building these characters and giving them some time to rest and have some, relaxing times and fun times. And they were doing stuff like playing games or just talking or whatever. And this is something else that I would like to mention, is that I thought that the episodes felt better structured, and I believe this is partially because the episodes were longer. I mean, overall, the game wasn't really that much longer than previous games, but instead of 5 episodes, it only had 4, and each episode was a bit longer than previously. And I think that is a good decision, because it helps the structure of the episode, since they always kind of have to end each episode in a cliffhanger due to the episodic nature of the game. They kind of want to end each episode with a hook. So by the end of an episode, you have to have this huge dramatic scene and then a cliffhanger. And it is kind of hard to write a story where like every 2 hours you have to have this huge drama, and you have very little time to actually build up to that drama or to, recover from that drama. And in this game, I felt the narrative structure was a lot better. So you had a build-up, and then you had a climax at the end of the episode, and then that climax would extend a little bit into the next episode. But then you would have like a peaceful period again, or just, smaller climaxes, maybe a little bit action, yes, but not like huge events. And then another build-up to another climax. So the first climax was basically the confrontation with Marlon, and then the second one was the attack of the raiders on Erickson, and then the third was the attack of the kids on the raiders. So these were basically your 3 cliffhangers, and in between them there were just like smaller tense moments. But I thought this narrative structure worked a lot better than previously, because I felt that in previous seasons they really had to rush from dramatic scene to dramatic scene and gave you little time to actually recover from the drama. So I thought this was a pretty good change, and it worked very well for the story in general. So yeah, because of this change between, the dramatic climax and then a period of peace and rest, this misery fatigue didn't set in the same way than it did in previous seasons. And like I said, in the end, most of the Erickson kids, or Texas 2 kids, actually survived. So for the first time, I felt that, I could actually get attached to characters again, because maybe they actually survive in the end. So again, this is something that was a lot better than previous seasons. Now, I felt that the third season already was going in that direction, because compared to season 1 and 2, the body count of protagonists was actually lower. But I thought it was better done in this season, because it gave you more time to get to know the characters and actually care for them. So that definitely gets a thumbs up from me. That is something that was definitely improved in this season. And then we have another point to talk about, which is the characters making stupid decisions for the sake of drama. Yes, it did happen, certainly, in this game. There was no amount of stupid decisions made by characters. However, it was a lot less jarring than in previous seasons, because for the most part, the people doing these bad decisions were kids or teenagers. So it was a lot more understandable why they did it, because they were inexperienced, because they couldn't handle the pressure. And also, since we were able to spend more time with each character, their bad decisions had some build-up as well. So their actions were explained a little bit better, and their motivations were explained a little bit better. So you could kind of understand why they did it, even though the decision was objectively bad. I mean, 10 would be an obvious example here. He was certainly prone to pretty poor decisions, but they try to explain why he is like that. And like I said, he's a kid, so I feel it's kind of hard to judge him for that. AJ obviously also made some bad decisions, like shooting Marlon. But again, he's a kid, and again, they kind of set this up by showing that AJ was just very twitchy in general, and that he didn't really have much experience being around people, and when he felt threatened, he would quickly act on gut instinct and so on. So again, yes, there were questionable decisions in this game, but it didn't really feel so bad, because most of the people doing it were still young and inexperienced, and B, because their personalities and motivations were explained better, so their decisions at least made sense from their perspective, and I could kind of see why they did what they did. Now, I would say that the worst offender in that regard was maybe season 2, because that was a season where you were playing the little kid and everyone else was an adult, and they were just making poor decisions all the time, so you, the protagonist, the little kid, could do all the heavy lifting and all the difficult stuff. So the setup for season 2 certainly aggravated that problem, whereas in this season it made it actually a lot more understandable. I did already talk about the mysterious scene where Clementine, for some reason, didn't remember that she could just cut off her infected leg. I guess you can come up with some explanation for that. I understand that they couldn't cut off her leg while they were still on the run from all the walkers, so she couldn't do it right after she got bitten. And I guess the most logical explanation is that she just thought it was too late. when they were finally safe and in the barn. But honestly, I feel she could at least have tried to do that or bring it up or whatever. And the fact that AJ, the 5-year-old, had to come up with that genius solution while Clementine didn't even bring it up is still slightly weird, at least. And I do believe that this is again a deliberate decision by the writers to make Clementine a little bit forgetful for the sake of that one dramatic scene where they try to make you believe that Clementine has died. That would be, I think, a classic example of this kind of problem. But for the most part, like I said, when people made stupid decisions in the game, I could somewhat understand it. Not everyone. I mean, Lily's decisions were kind of questionable too, and she doesn't have the excuse of being a child. But for all the Erickson kids, I can see it. I can see it. So again, this is another point where I thought the final season performed better than many of the predecessors, which means that overall I would rate this as one of the best seasons of this game. Maybe the best after the first. And the first season has the advantage of being like a fresh and new experience, whereas this season had to try a lot harder to bring in some new experience for the player. But as I said, I thought it certainly succeeded in doing that. So the question is there anything in particular that I would criticize about the season? I would say that maybe sometimes they did lean a bit too much into hyperbole. I mean, it is a very common thing in all the seasons that everything is just hyperbolic and extreme because it is an extreme situation and so on. And I did notice this too in this season. For example, just look at Lily's character, for example. When we met her the first time in like the second chapter, she actually seemed to be somewhat ambiguous. I mean, she already seemed rather cold and cruel, but it still felt like there was a bit of humanity left in her, like she didn't kill Clementine when she had a chance to do so. But then when we saw her again in like episode 3, she was just plain villain in a almost comic book villain level. I mean, there was nothing ambiguous about her anymore, and it felt a little bit over the top. They didn't really try to, I don't know, justify her motivations anymore or whatever. Yes, I said it's all about survival, but there's some things you can do for survival, and then there's some things where you cross a line. And to be honest, I am not even sure if it's all about survival. Like cutting out Lewis's tongue. Some of them were just out of, I don't know, sadism or because of a desire for power and control. As a matter of fact, I feel that the whole reason the Raiders are fighting is not so much about survival, but more about power. That's actually one thing that I have been pondering, if it was really strictly just about survival, surrendering might also be an option. The one thing that they keep asking others to do, submit, surrender, join their group. I mean, that would conceivably be an option for them as well, right? Why could they not just surrender and join the other group of people they're fighting? Now, to be fair, I don't know exactly what kind of fight they are involved in. Maybe that other group of people is not actually taking recruits. However, it is not unreasonable to assume that they basically have the same kind of problems than the Delta Raiders, meaning if they're in a constant battle, they lose people to walkers, to disease and whatever, so they have to replenish their, fighting population. And if that is true, then surrendering to them probably would be an option to survive as well. But obviously Lily and the other Delta Raiders don't want to surrender because they want to be the one who make others surrender. So it seems to be more about power than just mere survival, to be honest. But yeah, like I said, I thought Lily was, especially in the later chapters, maybe a little bit over the top, which actually made it fairly easy for me to pull the trigger or to tell AJ to pull the trigger, because I don't know, I didn't see any kind of ambiguity or humanity in her anymore. And at that point, I just thought, the world is a safer place without her, period. And another example might have been Minnie. Again, when she was introduced for the first time, I thought, okay, I can see what they're trying to do here. I can see what they're going for with this character and why she's doing what she's doing. Again, it's about survival and so on. But again, in following episodes, she completely lost it and she just went full out insane in the end. I don't know, maybe this is just stuff that happens in a situation like this, and maybe it's not for me to judge that. But again, it felt a little bit over the top in the end when she came out of the forest singing axe in hand with a group of walkers and tried to convince Ten to join her in death. I don't know. It felt very dramatic, maybe a little bit too dramatic. So, yeah, I guess that would maybe be one smaller point of criticism that I would mention. But other than that, I can't really think of much. A small amount of repetitiveness, a bit of hyperbole, some stupid decisions, but usually well enough explained. That would be maybe the criticism that I have. And like I said, compared to other seasons, I think this one did a lot of things better where the previous seasons failed. So yeah, overall, I am glad that I played this and that I finished the series. I think it's a good ending, and all things considered, it actually was sort of a happy ending. I mean, they're not safe by any means. I mean, they could still be attacked, and in a year or two, things could be very different. So it's definitely not and they lived happily ever after situation, because the world is still the way it is. But that's not going to change anytime soon. So considering the circumstances, this is probably the closest thing to a happy ending we were able to get in this game. And I did mention when I started the series or this season that I hoped for an ending that has a good closure. I didn't even expect a happy ending. I just wanted a finished ending, and I certainly got that. And that gets another thumbs up from me. So my expectations or my hopes were certainly met. Alright, I guess that would be all in regards to the general review of the game. And like I said, I have a few random assorted talking points that I thought about while playing the game, but while playing the game there's usually not enough time to actually talk about them because, there's a time decision coming up or whatever. So maybe I can talk about them a little bit now. One thing that I wanted to talk about are Clementine's rules. I mean, we had them all as a nice overview at the end. So Clementine wanted to teach AJ and wanted to raise him by giving him a set of simple rules, which makes sense. When a child is small, you give them very simple rules to follow. Of course, as we noticed, some of these rules were maybe a little bit overly simplistic, and they very, very quickly reached their limits in these extreme situations. I don't blame Clementine for that, because like I said, that's usually what you do with a little child. You give them a very simple rule, like, don't lie. Lying is bad. You're not going to teach a 5-year-old, yes, lying is bad, but, lying to the Nazi soldier about the Jew you're hiding in your basement is not bad. That's the classic example for that. It is an extreme example, but that's kind of the point. Clementine and AJ are living in an extreme situation. So very often these simple rules just didn't work out because the situations were just so extreme and unusual. Although I would argue that for some of them she could have known that this would cause problems, like always aim for the head. I actually picked that rule at the very beginning of the season. When we entered a house, that was probably infested with zombies. So obviously I told him, AJ, aim for the head, because that's the only way you can kill a zombie. And the game did imply that Clementine has been teaching him this particular rule before. But apparently she didn't teach him that, this is for zombies. And for humans, you have different options. You don't always have to go for the head. For a human, depending on the situation, shooting the leg might be a viable option and sometimes a better option. So when AJ shot Marlon, he was like, but you told me to always aim for the head, as if Clementine never told him that, in case of humans, you don't always have to kill them right away. There might be other options, depending on the situation. So again, that is certainly an example of a rule that was overly simplistic, and certainly one where Clementine could have thought about, being a little bit more complex. Especially if you teach a 5-year-old to shoot a gun, then maybe teaching him to go for the leg if it's a human and they're not like that big of a threat is not too much to ask. Of course, for some rules it's a little bit more difficult, like don't kill a person if they are not a threat anymore. That's the one that apparently confused AJ the most, because killing Marlon was wrong and killing Lily, at least in my determination, was not. Because in my opinion, she still was a threat and I didn't see any way to neutralize her non-lethally. I mean, we can't send her to prison or whatever. We can't lock her up somewhere and make sure that she can't harm us anymore. So if the option is to just shoot her or let her go, then I would say she's still a threat, because her behavior before that one scene certainly didn't make me believe that she would give up on her, crusade or whatever. So I would say the rule, don't kill people if they're not a threat, does still apply. It was just my assessment of the situation that was different. In my assessment, she was still a threat. And maybe that's what is confusing AJ. As a matter of fact, I have been looking at different outcomes, what happens if I pick a different decision. And as it turns out, if you do not kill Lily, she kills James. Because apparently she gets that little knife and then she stabs James in the back. So my assessment that she's still a threat was totally true. Obviously, AJ and Clementine couldn't know that, so using this fact as a justification doesn't really work. But the general idea that Lily was still a threat that we couldn't remove other by killing her because we can't send her to prison or whatever, as we would do in a normal world, is something that still stands in my opinion. And that is an example why, these rules kind of reach their limit in extreme situations. I mean, in our world, I would totally say, yes, if a person surrenders and you have a gun at their head, don't kill them. Call the police. They can take care of this person if they're bad or whatever. But this doesn't apply to this world, and that's kind of a problem. Some of the rules that apply to us don't apply to them anymore. And yeah, that's the difference between the situation and Marlon, because Marlon, I don't know, let's say I thought that he still was redeemable. And even if you think that he wasn't, the Erickson kids still had options in his case. They could say, okay, we will send you into exile. You have to leave Erickson, for example. Or they could allow him to stay, but not as a leader, so he can atone for what he did. There were options that, they could use instead of killing him. But I didn't really see any options in regards to Lily, Either let her go and be a threat again, or kill her. What else was there to do? And that's why, I said that the rule as taught by Clementine was overly simplistic, because context matters. And James, for example, he was even trying to compare this to the person that he killed. Apparently to him, killing his friend or colleague for expressing sympathy for the enemy was essentially equal to AJ killing Lily. And I don't think this is equal at all. Not every situation is like every other situation, James. Context matters. Just like not every group of people is like every other group of people just because they're all trying to survive. They all have different methods, and methods matter. But apparently to James, everything was just equal. So he was certainly the master of weak analogies. But yeah, this is just something random that came to my mind during that cave scene, and I didn't really remember to talk about it at the end of that episode. But I thought it is interesting that, you have these rules that you can teach AJ, but you notice that sometimes you notice that these rules are too simple for the world that they live in. Which means that in the end, AJ has to use his skills of critical thinking and not just mechanically following a set of rules that Clementine taught him. And I feel that is also kind of the point of the game, and that big decision at the end where you have to decide whether you want to trust his decisions. Because obviously, according to Clementine's rules, AJ should not have shot 10, right? Because, he was obviously not a threat. But not shooting 10 would mean that, in this case, Violet died. Now, to be fair, I looked it up and apparently Violet dies, but 10 survives. So it's just one of them who dies if AJ doesn't take the shot. But if you look at it from AJ's perspective, he certainly had a good reason to believe that the walkers would kill them both if he doesn't act. So it's easy to say, in hindsight, he traded one life for another, and maybe that was not morally right. But I think from his point of view, it was 2 lives or 1 life, and then he took the shot. So I think he kind of broke Clementine's rule, but he, applied critical thinking instead. And I feel that this was a major point of the game. So I thought this was pretty interesting. And yeah, usually this is stuff that, you might teach a child when they're, 10 or 12 and not a 5-year-old. So he certainly has to grow up a lot quicker than usually. But yeah, I guess that's all I wanted to talk about. There may have been other points that I had in my mind, but I can't remember, and the video is getting long enough, so I think I'm calling it quits here. But yes, just to summarize, I thought this was a very good season, one of my favorite. I'm glad that I finished the game franchise, even though I kind of burnt out of it a bit after the second season. But I'm glad I pulled through and got a nice, good ending with a good closure. So yeah, the final question is just, what's coming up next. As usual, I will take 1 day off in between games. So that would be Saturday. So if this video uploads on Thursday, then Saturday would be a day off. And on Monday, I'm going to start the next series, and it's going to be Assassin's Creed again. Assassin's Creed Unity, to be precise. So I hope you're looking forward to that. And until then, thank you for watching, and see you again next time.